Good morning, all, and welcome. I'm Kathleen Matheos from the Center for Higher Education Research and Development. I join you from University of Manitoba, and the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I welcome all of you from unceded lands on territories in which we have the privilege to work and live. Today, I'm really excited to introduce Gina Grandi. Gina Grandi is a professor, strategy and leadership, and dean of the Hill and Levine Schools of Business at University of Regina. In addition to that, she's a CHERD facilitator in several programs focusing on women in academia, and she's the lead facilitator of our upcoming Women in Academic Leadership program, which starts April the 3rd, 2023, in which there's just, I believe, 3 seats remaining. So welcome, Gina, and I'll turn this over to you. Just a note that if you have questions or any technical issues, just put them in the chat and I will address them. And I believe Gina is going to ask for Q&A in the Q&A document, the Q&A button. But I'll be keeping a handle on those if you run into problems with hearing us, etc. So I will now turn off my mic and my video and give it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. It's a real pleasure to be here. And for me, it is morning. And of course, depending on where you are in our country, for some of you, you are now kind of breaking into the afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you from the University of Regina campus located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional homeland of the Cree, Dene, Lakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Métis Nation. We give thanks to these groups for being stewards of this land for generations. And we are humbled by the opportunity to learn, live, play, grow, and work here. And we affirm our commitment to recognizing the historical and ongoing harms and to honoring the spirit of peace and friendship. We have about an hour together. As Kathleen has said, I'm going to ask if you have questions to put them in the Q&A box. But I also there are points in time where I'm going to ask you to engage throughout the next hour, and feel free to put that in the chat so we know who's out there. And so in the next little while, my intent really is for us to think meaningfully about the opportunity for women leaders in universities and how you, as either aspiring women leaders or women leaders already or allies of women leaders, might test the waters or shift the waters, and how allies can be a force for positive action. And so how is it we can move the dial so more women academics want to lean into leadership roles in universities, and how women leaders might do that? What I am going to ask is to get us started is if in the chat you might tell us from where you're joining us, and perhaps if you are an aspiring women leader in academia, currently a women leader, or if you are an ally. That would be helpful for me, and I think helpful for others to know who's joining us today in our conversations. This quote is from a woman university leader, and she said, "I believe in the role of public universities to support learning, growth, and change. Helping to shape the change we need to do too draws me to leadership work." And this was in response to a question I had asked her around why did she lean in? Why did she step up? And why does she continue to lead in a university setting? And throughout the session, I have some of these quotes inserted around so that you can start to hear the stories of women leaders in academia. Maybe some or one of them might resonate with your position and your place. And part of that is also about recognizing that our stories are diverse. So as women leaders in academia, we don't all have the same stories. We don't all have the same approach. We don't all look and sound the same. And it is about crafting our stories, embracing our stories, and allowing us to craft the stories that make meaning for us. Here's what I hope we'll achieve at the end of the hour. to better understand the need and opportunity for more women leaders in our universities and college, and not only the need, but also the opportunity. To identify personal strategies for creating paths to leadership for women academics, and to understand the importance and tactics of positive change to create space for more women leaders in academia. Right now, more than 50% of university students in Canada identify as women. My question then becomes, and if we start to look at associate professors, full professors, why aren't there more women leading in universities? Now, I also think it's important to contextualize what I mean by leadership for the context of most of my conversation. Leadership in academia operates at many levels, multiple levels. Individual professors, especially those who lead large research groups or have large externally funded projects, exercise leadership and have substantial management responsibilities. These responsibilities overlap significantly with individuals in positions of institutional responsibility within academia. So whether that's department chairs, associate deans, associate vice presidents. I'm mostly talking about institutional leadership for the duration of our conversation, but I believe that has aspects that transcend across the contributions that are made across academia. Again, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions as we go, so you can, I'll try to keep an eye on those, but Kathleen will also keep an eye on those if I miss something. And depending on how our conversation goes throughout, we should have time towards the end as well. Again, I'm going to encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to tell us from where you're joining today. And, really, do you currently hold a leadership position? Or are you aspiring or curious? My assumption is if you're here, you are at least curious. I want to be very clear that my intent today is not about fixing women. And while there may be some aspects where I talk about learning to navigate the system, I very firmly believe this is not about saying women don't have enough confidence, so we need to do these things to increase their confidence because there's a problem with women. That is not my intent at all, and I want to be very clear about that as we move forward. This is really about discovering, crafting your story and journey into leadership, or finding ways to champion allyship. And along the way, I offer some facts, suggestions, and possible paths so that you can create and craft the journey that works with you and for you. To start, then, I want to give a little bit of a context and picture of who holds institutional power in universities in Canada. Now, my intent is not to depress you when you see some of this. It is about, for me, reminding us of the need to have more women in leadership positions in universities across Canada. And also, for those of you who are thinking about it, is to actually to get you thinking about the opportunity that is there. What you see here now on the screen is work was done by Melinda Smith in 2019. It's a bit dated, but I am going to update it in just a second. Looking at the diversity gap in U15 universities across the country. So what we can see here is it looked at, the study examined almost 400 individuals serving in dean's roles, provosts, vice presidents, chancellors, board chairs, as well as individuals in kind of president or president type of roles. Now, you can see as we look throughout, not only do we see, at the vice president's role, we see a larger percentage of women, but not only do we see really that gap in percentage of women holding the roles across the scope, but when we start to look at other considerations of diversity and intersecting identities, we see that there's quite a lot of work to be done. Overall, there are a number of findings from the work that Melinda has done. What also is interesting is most senior academic leadership positions are overwhelmingly drawn from science, technology, engineering, and math. And also interesting that when we look to the Board of Governors for the U15 universities, they're largely drawn from a few professional fields. Now, you might say, Gina, it's a bit dated. 2019 means that it was probably earlier than that. Well, I did something a couple of days ago just to give us a picture of where we are now, to do a scan of the U15 presidents in 2023. And in fairness, one of these people will start in April. In part, a flawed methodology on my part, because I didn't actually look up for all of them in regards to how they identify. So there's a flaw, and I'm making assumptions based on what we see and sex category. But what we can see here is, if you go along with those flaws I've identified in my methodology, of the 15, 2 are women, and I can tell you that one of those 2 is an interim president. If we look to other considerations of intersecting identities, again, we will also see a big void there. So when Melinda did her study for 2019, I think it said about 13%, and we're still sitting at 13%. And in fact, I might argue maybe lower, because one of those 2 women are actually in an interim position. So there is a lot of work still to be done. If we look more broadly, and this was the most recent stats I could get from Universities Canada, so it is a little bit dated. 40% women faculty at Canadian universities were women. And again, that's 2016, but 2019, 25 women university presidents, making up about 26% of Universities Canada membership, up from 20% in 2015. So it looks like some change is happening, but there's still a long way to get to be able to get at that 50% mark or somewhere thereabouts. This is another study done in 2020, looking at institutional leadership in universities across Canada by Souquier and colleagues. What we see here is that number. It looks at about 30%. They employed a similar methodology as my images, so there are flaws in there. They looked at images of senior leaders and categorized them according to gender, racialized status, and Indigenous. And so, that is a flawed methodology. Still, though, presents some interesting considerations, and maybe not alarming, but certainly that notion of there's a great need, and there's certainly an opportunity. So there's significant variation across universities and leadership ranks. Close to half, 42%, reached or exceeded gender parity, but 11 universities at that point in time had no women in leadership roles. In terms of representation of visible minorities, among more of the 50% of the 76 studied, they were unable to identify a single visible minority across senior leadership. Only 8 of the universities had Black representation in their leadership. So again, when we start looking at all of these different considerations, there is still a lot of work to do. And so there is a need, but I would also suggest there is far more opportunity available as well. If I switch gears from kind of the context to say there's a lot of work we still need to do, there's a lot of opportunities out there for women, and I'm going to argue a need for more women leaders and more diversity in university leadership. I switch now to some possibilities around strategy. So for those of you who are thinking about it, for those of you who are already holding one and thinking about, well, actually, what might be my next step? This is not an exhaustive list of strategies, but really a starting point in many ways. Strategy 1 is knowing yourself and crafting your own story. Put it in another way, I would say it is critically important as you think about leadership, but also as you hold a leadership position, is to know what guides your leadership. And for a number of reasons, but I would say increasing our self-awareness is really the first stage of becoming a more effective leader. Knowing what is important to us, what guides us, is critical to growing our self-awareness. A quote from a woman university leader in asking her what inspired her, what kind of triggered the notion to step in. And she said, for me, it was a natural evolution. I was also in leadership roles as a student, including serving as president of my university's grad student government during my PhD. I stepped into a large in-scope admin role 10 months into my first tenure track appointment, despite the protestations of my chair, who didn't like to see a junior colleague take on such a role. Because there was a vacancy that needed filling, and I knew I could do it and would love it. Since then, I've always been in a leadership role. And a little bit later, I'm going to make a suggestion about, well, at least what I might suggest to many women leaders are thinking about this if they have research responsibilities. And I may have taken a similar view as the chair of this person as well. Other stories, it's just how I'm wired. I love universities. I find university leadership roles fun, interesting, and rewarding. I love the practical problem solving, and I love the connections with folks right across the institution and in the community. Another story, I'm philosophically committed to the importance of collegial governance, of governance by professors. It is crucial, I think, that universities' academic mission be led by professors, not by managers from other sectors. I put my money where my mouth is by serving in leadership roles.
You want me to put a message in there for everyone?
Excuse me, chat is now working.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. So please tell us where you're joining us from. And finally, my leadership also has a subversive motivation. I was a non-traditional student, a mature first-generation university student with a child. I took a crooked path through my own studies because no one in my family knew anything about university study. I didn't have any insider advice and needed to learn the code of university study and later work. As a university leader today, I try to help other newcomers and outsiders decode the university so that we can recode it together. I hope by providing you these little glimpses of these stories that for some of you, it might trigger, right? That you identify, or you think, yeah, I feel similar, or no, I identify with that. All of our stories are different, but understanding why and ourselves and what's important is really critical in that path. If we look at understanding ourselves a little bit better, I mean, here's what I would suggest is spend time understanding yourself and what matters, but also to seek out feedback. And, you know, the latter can mean you can run into, if you don't, you can run into blind spots. So if we look to this matrix here, Urich's matrix, it talks about two types of self-awareness, internal self-awareness, and that comes from that reflection activity, understanding your values, understanding the influences that play a role in how you make decisions, how you lead, how you respond to others. And the external self-awareness is understanding how others view us in terms of our values and passions. You can see here on the matrix that obviously the ideal is be aware. So you know who you are, what you want to accomplish, and seek out value and value others' opinions. I believe it can, in seeking out and understanding how others perceive our values and what we're doing, places us in a vulnerable position sometimes. I think if we are led, so on the bottom, if we are pleasers and it's completely driven by what others think, it's not necessarily going to make you all that content and happy or others, but trying to get that balance of understanding self, but also making sure we don't fall into a situation where I do know myself, doesn't matter to me what they think, because it can lead to blind spots. Our values are deeply held beliefs that are statements of ideals. So they coincide with what we believe is right, just, ethical, moral. And they also help us make choices about how we live and inspire us to take action as leaders. Often, we don't engage in a process to be clear with ourselves. What are those values? And we're unaware of why we are engaging. I have a little exercise that I'd like us all to do. So this is a list of values. They are not an exhaustive list, so you don't necessarily have to choose these. But I'd like for you to take just a minute here. And I want you to take a sheet of paper if you can. And write down 10 values that can come from this list or others that you think are important to you. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes for you to kind of scribble down what are some of those values, what's important to you, what do you value, what guides your practice and your decision making. So just take a few minutes. I'm going to time here 3 minutes, and let's see what you have. This is kind of an abbreviated form of this exercise, and something that you certainly can spend more time on. Okay, assuming you have those 10 values, take 2 minutes to put a star beside the 5 values that are most important to you. So of that 10, put a little star next to the top 5. Not a great time teller, but I'm going to move forward. Now it gets harder again. I want you to circle the 2 values that are your top, that you hold at the level of principle. So essentially that they guide your day-to-day decisions at work. And I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat. So if you feel comfortable doing that. So put in the 2 values that you hold at the level of principle. So those 2 of the 10 that you would prioritize. And when you have those, I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat. Okay, oh, this is great. I see them coming in here. So I see authenticity and respect, creativity, knowledge, caring, creativity, autonomy and authenticity, knowledge and achievement, and creativity and tolerance, honesty, accuracy, courage, social justice, authenticity, cooperation, openness, dependability, caring, service. Authenticity is one that's coming up quite a lot. Openness. Thank you for doing that. I mean, and you might say, well, why does this matter? Well, for a couple of reasons. It's interesting to see how when we talk about crafting our stories, there are some people on the line, right, where we see values alignment. You need to be clear about your key values as an effective leader. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to decide how you use your energy and your abilities. You can end up fighting every issue that you see otherwise. A leader with clear values is motivated to act because they recognize when change is needed, and also not because somebody else points it out. They are convinced that the status quo is not acceptable because it is out of step with what they believe is right or good. Without this awareness, we often react in situations or to people in ways that are not always constructive, maybe don't always reflect our best selves. And it is because there is often a values misalignment. Knowing and recognizing it, whether alignment or misalignment, allows us to better support others in our capacity as leaders, have better emotional regulation, and also engage in more effective decision making. Now, there are lots of other activities that you can do around values. Lifeline exercise is one that's really good as well. The other one I would say that you might want to consider looking at, there's one called the social grace exercise with lots of G's, R's, A's, E's, C's. And it's a useful way of thinking about different aspects of our identity, which we publicly acknowledge and are evident to others, regardless of whether we choose to share or not. And conversely, it can describe aspects of our identity which are not immediately visible or known to others. Again, about increasing our level of self-awareness. Now, while I'm not going to give you time to think about these questions, I am going to put them up there, and I'm going to encourage you to maybe pick one of those as kind of a takeaway for you. So think of a colleague or leader whom you perceive to be effective at their job. What about them serve as indicators to you of effectiveness? They're friendly, they meet deadlines, they publish regularly. Do those values you identified earlier help to explain the conclusions you're making about how effective they are? The flip side of that is think of a colleague or a leader you perceive to be ineffective at their job. And again, thinking about what are the indicators to you of their ineffectiveness, and going back to your values to see, does it help explain some of those conclusions you're making? Think of a situation where you had to carry out a decision that someone else made and it didn't sit right with you. Again, going back to your values to think about explaining that misalignment. Think about a situation where you led or were part of an initiative that felt good. And finally, think about your current role. What activities seem to give you energy? What activities seem to completely drain you? Do the values you identify with or you identify help to explain those feelings? And that self-awareness is so important also when you're thinking about stepping forward and thinking about and identifying, is there values alignment with the institution or the people that you work with? And if there isn't, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you don't engage, but being aware. So our values are reflected in our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, and our self-awareness grows when we pay attention to the signals of our values. We become clearer about the values. And I'll just share this. I've learned over the years that when something isn't quite right, when I'm in a room, whether that's a discussion that's happening or something that's happening, I have actually a physiological response. My stomach flips. And I have learned mostly that when that happens and I'm in a meeting, whether I'm leading it or not, is to try to pause and to try to identify, okay, what is happening here that's actually making me uncomfortable? What is happening here that doesn't sit right? Sometimes I can't name it. And sometimes what I'll say is, there's something about this conversation right now is making me uncomfortable. To pause and to think about it. So again, knowing yourself and how you respond, even physiologically in situations, helps you to be able to respond more effectively. And I think also sometimes have what we can refer to as everyday courage. So I'll move from, I've spent a bit of time on one, I won't spend as much time on the other 6, but strategy 2, my suggestion is to observe and learn from others. Others are gifts in our leadership journey. And even if they're not others who you might say, I don't want to emulate that leadership. Well, I would say that's a gift to you because you actually can observe others and you're saying, that's not who I want to be, or that's not how I want to approach that situation. It's also a reminder to us that there is no one right way of leadership style or approach, despite what research says around, some styles that are more effective than others. I had at one point in time had someone to whom I reported the position. I had 2 people in a short period of time holding that role. They could not have been more different in their styles. One, I would say, could be described as that typical visionary, kind of big ideas, looking for the next thing around the status quo, incredibly creative. But I would also say, not really thinking about kind of the implementation and how this would unfold. And the one that followed, I would say, far more perhaps operational and kind of thoughtful around the implementation. And what's interesting to me is when I lived those experiences and had a lot of respect for both of them, but I found both of them frustrating in different ways. The visionary, I felt like I was always the one who was saying, okay, that's not going to work because of this. Or we can't do this because, which is not the role that I like to have. And with the other person, it was the other, I would find it frustrating because I had to justify every new idea I had because they were more cautious. But they both gave me gifts that I hope have made me a more effective leader. And kind of taking from those different styles has made me more thoughtful before I jump, but also on the other hand, that notion of being able to balance that creativity and the vision of where we want to get with, can we actually do this reasonably? So my suggestion is to observe others. Think about what frustrates you, disappoints you, energizes you about their approach. We are often drawn to others like us, whether disciplinary background, culture, gender. And it's important to have those people we can identify with. But also we have to remember that everyone is wonderfully flawed, so we have to manage our expectations. But also I would say, look to see what we can learn from those you may not identify with. Strategy 3, create your network. My view is, and others are similar, but not everyone, that the meritocracy is a myth. And indeed, there's research that indicates that lots of people overestimate the importance of formal training, qualifications, and that's how hiring decisions are made. So this belief that decisions are based only on the notion that the best are chosen, hard work and talent are always rewarded, so that people are promoted because they're the most qualified in kind of objective terms. Many believe in it, but lots of people will say that it exists really to explain actions that preserve the status quo. And so often we use this rationalization, but in doing so, we possibly underutilize or undervalue the importance of advocacy, our own advocacy of others, but also networking. And I know Drew Marshall did a session a while back, a webinar on networking. And again, the research says this, that women are less likely to engage in networking and engage in kind of the same scope and type of networking as men. Again, I want to be clear, I'm not advocating to fix women, rather more about an awareness of how the process works, and that networking and advocacy is also part of hiring processes, and perhaps more than we'd like to think it is. Research also shows that women are less likely to ask someone for a referral when they're applying for a position than a man. Strategy 4, invest in your own leadership development or ask somebody else to invest in you. So we have lots of organizations are talking about a commitment to EDIA and indigenization. Well, are they putting their money where their mouth is? And so if you have an interest, make that known. Ask for support for leadership development. So Kathleen's shop has a ton of programs around university governance. And so thinking about where you have those gaps, but also thinking about the networks you can build. I did the SUAC program, and the SUAC program is more around kind of the university institutional considerations. It is great, and you get a network from across the country. Training and exposure around equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. Do your own work and build your knowledge around truth and reconciliation. I offer one example there, the 4 seasons of reconciliation offered through First Nations. There are others, and it's just really the tip of the iceberg. And then the other one I would encourage you to think about if you're not familiar is the Senior Women Academic Administrators of Canada, SWAC, which is a national network. They have an annual conference. You don't have to submit a paper, you go. It is an investment, but I would say for me, an incredible opportunity to get access to hear from women who are in senior leadership roles, but also to build that network across the country. Yes, we can certainly, Stephanie, provide a copy of the slideshow. I'm sure we can do that, Kathleen, can't we?
We can, definitely.
Great, thank you. Okay, so strategy 5 and 6. The first, and it contradicts something I'm going to say a little bit later to a certain extent, but learn to say no and seek out valued service work. And I think that valued is up for interpretation, but too many women academics do more than their fair share of service work. And I would say a lot of that service work is invisible service work. So we know it has to get done, But more likely to get asked to do it, more likely to say yes. And when it comes for tenure and for promotion, it's not necessarily viewed as having the value. So people are grateful you did it, but it actually isn't valued as much. If you were in a research, if you're in a position, an academic position that has research responsibilities, when it comes down to it, whether you had on three extra committees that you served on, but you didn't have as many research publications. And so know that system and learn how to say no. It doesn't mean say no to everything. If your role has research responsibilities, I'm going to say to you to keep an eye on what it takes to obtain full professorship. And so in some ways, this goes against what the quote I had earlier, where someone said they jumped into it. We have to know what matters to us. But I can tell you in my role as dean, I am reluctant to have a woman step into an associate dean role unless I know that they are very close to promotion to full prof, because those types of roles will, especially if you enact in service to others, will mean that what gets put aside will be your research responsibilities, and it becomes harder to get promotion to full prof. So I'm going to say to you, and I have not always been very good at it, but be relentless. Just don't neglect your other service responsibilities. I'm also going to encourage you to be a bit, I'm going to say, strategic. Identify the most influential committees in your unit or across campus and express your interest in serving on those, or ask others how they ended up in the roles. So looking at committees that make budget decisions, look at committees that are kind of evaluating research proposals that are going forward. Think about who's at that table and why. So be visible in places where people making the decisions about those committees are going to be present. When I moved to University of Regina, I was in a faculty role. I was an associate professor. I have some background. One of my areas is strategy and leadership. I wasn't here very long, and a call went out for the University Strategic Planning Committee. I've done strategic planning elsewhere, but I had actually never been involved in a university strategic planning process. And I also didn't have any connections across campus. What I did was I found out who was leading on it. I asked for a meeting, and I went over and I spent, rather than sending in just my interest by email, I asked to meet with them. And it gave me an opportunity to tell them why I was interested, what I thought I could bring to the table, but I understood they needed representation across the university. What was really interesting is, and I had no social capital in the institution. What was really interesting in that committee was one of my colleagues also put their name forward, and they had a lot of social capital in the institution. They had done this kind of work. But in that instance, they actually put two from the same faculty on the university strategic planning team. And I am convinced that my name would not have been included had I not went over to speak to that person to have the conversation. Think about Senate, getting a sense of how ultimate university decisions are made, the University Research Committee, the University Teaching Committee. Think about where you have gaps in your CV, but also think about what matters to you in your leadership. Again, though, I'm going to say be selective and kind of have that plan. Strategy 6, and I've touched on it a little bit, make your interests known and ask for specific feedback. Now, I will also say, and I don't want to be naive, being direct sometimes does come with risks. When I was interviewed here at the University of Regina, I was an associate professor, and I thought fairly close to full professor. And in my meeting with one of the people that was organized in the faculty, I asked the question, what do I need to do to become full prof here? And I think it was actually a very reasonable question to ask, given where I was and why would I move? Like, was I going to get put behind? And what was really interesting to me was clearly I threw the person off, and they came back and said, it was a man colleague who said, well, we haven't hired you yet. It wasn't what I said when I asked the question, but there is, I would also suggest at that point in my career, if I wasn't thinking about full professorship, why would they want me? So I think it is important to make your interest known. And I think it's also important to ask for specific feedback. Often there is a discomfort in giving feedback that actually is going to allow someone to move forward. And the research shows that those who are giving feedback are less likely to give direct and specific feedback to women. They're more likely to give it to men for reasons that you know, I have some thoughts on the reasons, but again, this is your career. We can say people should be giving you the advice, but if they're not, make those plans to actually ask those questions so that you can get that feedback, even if it's hard to hear, even if it's not so constructive, like, well, we haven't hired you yet. I'm going to move to strategy 7. And before I do that, there's lots of research that's out there that and will contradict some of what's here. But this is important, and I think it is a myth. Not a myth that there are a lot of women who say this, but I think a myth in parts of it holding us back. So you don't have to respond, but this notion of someone approaching to consider a leadership position and saying, I'm not ready. No, not right now. That isn't for me. What's really interesting is this, I would say, is my story. In particular, when I was asked when I was shoulder tapped by a man leader in the institution to consider putting my name forward for the decanal position, I'm sure I said this and I know I thought it. And what's really disturbing to me is I know the research that says that women more often than men will say they're not ready, or they are less likely to apply if they don't meet all of the required qualifications. So various reports and studies suggest women are less likely to apply if they don't meet the ideal candidate qualifications. Some say men will apply for a job when they only meet 60% of the qualifications listed, while women will apply only if they meet 100%. And the conclusion that's often drawn is that women don't have the confidence. So let's fix women and let's boost their confidence. That's not my intent with this slide or the next. In a study by Moore published in Harvard Business Review, it's a bit dated, but they asked women why they didn't apply. And for me, there were 3 very interesting findings. First, men and women, although a higher percentage of women, expressed that they didn't want to waste their time and energy because they didn't think they would get the role. There are a couple of takeaways, I think, there. People often think that the required qualifications that are listed are, well, required qualifications. And they don't see the recruitment and hiring process as one where advocacy, relationships, or a creative approach to framing one's expertise could overcome not having all of the skills and experience in the job qualifications. So it is a mistaken perception about the hiring process and not necessarily about the individual. Another takeaway is that women, and this is something for allies to keep in mind, need better information about how hiring processes work. For women, one thing you could do is also put your name forward for a search committee for a vice president or president search, so you can kind of get that insider view of how those decisions are made. Now, I don't want to neglect the fact that bias does exist, and certainly some women do need to meet more of the qualifications to be hired than men counterparts. So this is not a fabric of women's imagination that actually they are kind of being evaluated more strictly around those than others. Second, when asked why they didn't apply, another group of women said, I didn't think I met the qualifications, and I didn't want to put myself out there if I was likely to fail. That was 22% of the women compared to 13% of the men. They also believe the noted qualifications were real, but the cost of failure to them was a risk rather than kind of wasting time or energy. So that fear, I would say, a takeaway is real, and there is evidence to suggest women's failures are remembered longer than men's. But that kind of bias that we internalize can lead us to become too afraid to fail. I also suggest we need to expand conversations about women's relationship with failure and how bias, stereotype, threat, and the absence of women leaders may all contribute to a greater avoidance of failure. And finally, another group of women in that same study said if they didn't apply because they didn't meet the guidelines of who should apply. And so the argument in explaining that is at a young age, women are socialized to follow the rules and that there are costs to rule breaking. But rule following habits in this instance do have costs in regards to women's advancement. So I'm going to encourage you to test the waters. I'm going to say, and this in a couple of ways. One, I'm going to say apply. Reframe it to a learning experience. My experience is that when I have applied for a position, despite wondering if it was worth the time, despite the vulnerability of, oh, I'm not going to get it, so people will know, but reframing it to one of a learning experience, I have taken away tremendous amount. It really is a good learning experience. You get familiarity with the process, the types of questions. You learn if it's the type of role or institution where you really want to be. And you will be better prepared when the right one comes along for you. You also might surprise yourself in the sense that you might get an offer when you actually aren't sure whether you will or no. Secondly, I'm going to say take a smaller bite. So if you're not sure, take a smaller bite. If an acting role comes up, if a program lead role comes up, chairing a committee role, chairing a task force, I'm also even going to suggest union executive positions. And I would say in my experience, unions are often, in a faculty association, are often looking for people to step in to lead. And I have done that in the past, and it was tremendous experience in understanding the parts of a university that I didn't have that experience before. And the other thing I'm going to say to you is, in some ways, don't do what I almost did. I was asked a while back, the dean asked me to take on an acting AD role for 6 months. You know, my immediate response was no, but thank you. I did have enough kind of reflection to say, but let me think about it for the weekend. And in the end, I decided to do it. And it was a tremendous learning experience. So don't get too caught up in, I've made this commitment, I can't come out of it. Engage, try it out, test the waters, because you will learn a tremendous amount. And you can always walk away if it isn't the right position for you. My last slide then, I'm just going to say thank you very much, Donna, for joining and for actually sharing information about SWAC, which is super. My last slide then is really about, for those who are here as allies or those women who are here who are already in leadership roles, and what we can do in taking positive action. Where we want to do and where we want to be is moving towards equity, not equality. And sometimes that creates discomfort for us and discomfort for others. We do need to do more to achieve equity. And I would say that that means having the everyday courage to take positive action to redress the imbalance that's in place. So this means not just providing the same opportunities for women, but actually investing more or differently to create paths for women. There are systemic barriers to inclusivity for women in academic leadership. There is discrimination, there is unconscious bias, and there is stereotyping around effective leadership styles. It is changing, but too slowly, and real change requires positive action. And I have a great story if I get time to share, but I am going to share. I have 7 strategies here. Again, not exhaustive. Asking yourself as a leader, as an ally, who is doing what service work? Look at the composition of your committees and those key committees to see how much, how visible, how meaningful is this service work for those women in your unit, for their tenure, for their promotion, for their visibility in the institution, to give them opportunities to step into leadership roles. Think about and look hard at the job posting language. Right now, there are gender decoders, and I think there are some out there that are kind of inclusive decoders that look beyond just gender. So looking at the language around what's being used and the language, is it kind of more masculine or feminine? The other thing I'm going to suggest is that that notion, what I said earlier around women more than men are saying, well, if there are qualifications, then they're required. I'm seeing more and more ads where they're saying actually no one candidate is expected to have all or to meet all of these. So keep that in mind as well in looking at our ads. I also encourage you to think about targeted positions. And so to have the courage, again, I'm going to say before you do that, make sure the institution has appropriate policies and procedures in place to support it. Unconscious bias training for everyone who's involved in search roles, and I would say across your unit, and having that comfort level and being able to call that out when we see it and when we feel it. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of sponsorship and shoulder tapping. I am certain I would not be in the dean role I am in right now had someone who was in a senior leadership role had not had a conversation with me that I should apply. And in fact, I was so stubborn, it required them to have 2 conversations with me and somebody else in a senior leadership role to encourage me to apply. And so that sponsorship is not, mentorship's important and you give time. Sponsorship is actually advocating for somebody. It's actually giving their name, recommending them. So it is more than giving them time to give advice. It is actually advocating and creating opportunities for them. Offer constructive and career advancement feedback. So spend time to have clear expectations, understand the goals and the objectives of the person, and be candid but supportive in trying to get them there. Also going to encourage you to think about hiring for potential and transferable experiences. And search committees are shown to be more likely to look at kind of that formal. This is part of the people applying, but also what you're looking at. So somebody may not have been an associate dean, someone may not have been department chair, but they may have led various committees. They may have done other types of things in their life, for example, leading boards outside of universities. Look at those transferable experiences when you are trying to identify if there is fit here or potential fit for women in these academic leadership roles. And finally, I'm going to say is invest in their leadership development. So shoulder tap women and say, I'm willing to pay for you to do this program or this program, and just for you to think about if this might be something you're interested in. And that may mean investing in women, and you're not doing the same type of investment for other colleagues that you may have. But again, I would say that actually that is not favoritism, that is not discrimination, that is actually positive action to be able to create change and redress what is an imbalance. Now, I am going to stop there. We have a few minutes, not much. I don't see any questions so far, but I am curious if I stop sharing my screen and come back to you. Do we have any questions from anyone in the last couple of minutes? Any thoughts, questions from anyone? Kathleen, I'm not missing anything, am I, in regards to the
No, now that I figured out it was me that had disabled the chat when I bumped something. Yeah, any comments, questions, please feel free. Oh, okay, Carlene has a question.
Okay. Carlene, thanks. Do you have any stats on queer and trans leaders? Great question. And I'm going to say no, Carlene. I'll see if I have something else that I can send to you. When we look at what Universities Canada collects, it has looked at, oh, I don't have that with me. I'll send you something, Carlene. They actually have something at the top leadership ranks, which I will send to you. But what I have seen, it is very, very small. And I would say it's whether or not, of course, someone self-identifies. So there isn't very much collected. And I think it's only now we're in a place where we're starting to ask those questions. My guess is, though, Carlene, when we start to look at intersecting identities around racialized individuals, the number goes smaller and smaller. And my guess is as we also start to look at queer and trans leaders, it gets smaller and smaller. So there is a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. So I see, okay, Carlene, I'm going to read your comment. I feel like it's a trend in the last couple of years to leave LGBTQ folks off to equity, to leave them off equity task force. Interesting. Okay, well, that certainly is unfortunate. Carlene, if I have your information, I'll send you what I do have, but I have it in a different file. But we're only now starting to collect that data. And when you look at, if we just look at gender and a binary version of gender, we have a lot of work to be done, and I think we're not having those conversations as much as we should. Okay, I see a couple of questions here quickly. Can you speak briefly to achieving balance between leadership roles and family and other responsibilities? It's a great question, Monica. More I read, more my own life, I would say this is not I think it is difficult to get balance kind of between work life and that perfect balance. Here's what I would say is, I'm not sure we can achieve it all in all the one time. I think when we pull one way, there is something in our lives. But here's what I can also say is allies, that it is also really important for those who are leading to keep that in mind. So for example, about when you're having meetings, when you're sending emails, if you have events that happen in the evening, having those open conversations with people who lead alongside you so that they feel comfortable saying, I can't make a 6 o'clock event because I have family responsibilities. So I'm going to frame that more around actually as those of us in leadership positions having to do more to make sure actually we're having those conversations and that we don't make these positions impossible for people who actually do have family and other responsibilities. So I'm going to put the responsibility of that on leaders who are currently in position rather than the individuals who may feel that they're struggling with that. As a new junior researcher, what would you recommend as first steps or things to look at for someone new starting out? Things to come to mind around joining early on in committees. Yeah, so a couple of things I would say to you is, first off, be relentless about where you say yes to service. I would think as a junior researcher, I would be looking at key committees like in your unit, kind of the research committee. I'd also be looking at some of the, if you have to do university service, being strategic. So whether it's Senate or whether it is putting your name for a university wide. The other thing I'm going to say is it isn't too early to start looking at doing some leadership development opportunities so you get a better sense of where is the power, so to speak. And the last thing I'm going to say to that is if you have other women leaders in your institution or a network, is have conversations with them early and start that now so you can try to figure out what is the right path for you. Hopefully that was helpful. But Carlene, I will send you what I have. I think we're at time, aren't we, Kathleen?
We're at time, yeah. I just wanted to say one little thing about networking. It's really important, and it's really important to sustain it, because it's one thing to build it, because that network is going to be invaluable to you over the next 10 so years.
And Kathleen, if I can add to that, I can say from my own experience, sometimes we kind of trade off like, ooh, I have to get this done. It isn't a good use of my time. But I would actually say sometimes the greatest ideas, sometimes the greatest support actually comes from those networks where we can initially think it's not a good use of my time. So it can pay off in the moment, but it certainly will pay off over time as well. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope that it has whet your appetite for those of you thinking about it. And by all means, feel free to reach out to me to refer to some resources or a conversation. So thanks very much, everyone, for being here today.
And thank you very much, Gina, and thank you all. The video will be available on the CHERD website so that anyone can review it.